Today we're going to talk about sin. Sin is simply missing the mark of God's perfect will. Sin breaks relationship with God. And from God's perspective, it must be punished. Now, when we're talking about missing God's mark, we're talking about it in terms of like shooting an arrow at a target. You've missed the perfect will of the Father, and this is sin. Now, the separation we're talking about from God is actually punishment, what we call hell. The Bible describes as eternal separation from God. Now, the Bible often relates metaphorically sin against God as adultery. And I think probably this is the case because the imagery is so clear of how devastating it is when you break faith and are in betrayal in the marital relationship. And adultery is the most extreme example of breaking faith and trust and destruction in relationship. And I think this is why he uses it. And I think it's important to us to see how horrific it is as we take a heart of sin against God, what it means to him. Now, sin, again, is simply just missing the mark of what God has established. In the garden, the first act of rebellion was perpetrated by Adam and Eve. Sin isn't necessarily something that's bad as you might think. Think of the Garden of Eden. It was just eating from the certain tree, right? More simply, it's doing something outside the will of God. His will has been established in the command to love your neighbor yourself. So really what we're talking about, sin is just self-will. And then when we're obedient or under submission to God or in relationship with God, we're simply putting away self-will and starting to love others as we would have ourselves be loved. Now, interesting, let's look at Satan for a minute. Satan was moved from heaven for an act of self-will, self-exaltation, making himself equal with God. Now, this pride, remember he didn't murder someone, this pride, assuming equality with God, is really the root of all sin, making our will as a suitable substitute for the will of God. We believe our will is equal, maybe even preferable to God's will. This is really this self-will, an expression of our self-will, and this is the primary problem we have in our relationship with God. Now, culture has established many demands, but these may or may not fit into God's will. So due to pressure from the culture, one may willfully submit to the various rules and regulations of that culture. And one who joins the culture, perpetuating their cause and supporting their ideals, that person feels moral and make the assumption that they're somehow approved by God because they feel moral. They're following the decrees of the culture. So you might feel just before God because the culture approves you. Now, this puts us in an unenviable position, thinking we are good with God because we are good with culture. I think you can see the problem with that, this self-approval because of what culture has said. Trapping us, we assume that God is approving us also, and that could be detrimental. It is certainly this sinful act that is wrong, but the origin of the sin, that is what is truly the problem. It's kind of an attitude. It's something that's generated from the heart. There is a heart that's opposed to God's will, and there's another one that is inclined towards his will and is interested in submitting to him. One that is opposed to God is a sinful heart. One inclined toward God and submitted to him is a heart that's pleasing. That heart which is not sinful. Now, again, sin began in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve, tempted by Satan. They ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They were told that they weren't permitted to. At this point, death entered into the world and humanity under a curse due to this violation. The sin removed us, humanity, from the intimate interaction we had with God in the garden. Now, here we are, many thousands of years later, we come into the picture, born as rebellious sinners without access to God. We are guilty, and as punishment is our destiny. And right now, God's wrath is upon us here on earth and will be in the future in hell, where at that point we will receive the completion of our punishment, eternal damnation, eternal punishment. So what I would like you to do, as we're talking about sin, talk to each other about the difference between cultural sin and one against God. Talk to each other about justice in our system and how it relates to God's judgment. How do we break relationships with others because of our sin against them? What is the effect? Similarly, how does this sin separate us from God? Here are some verses for reflection. I would like you to study these, read them, study them, think about them throughout the week. Romans 3:23, Romans 6:23, and Romans 5:12.